Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take your sources, dig in, and pull out what you really need to know fast.
Yep, we know you want to get up to speed on complex stuff without getting bogged down.
And that's what we do. Today, we're looking at the first 100 days of Donald Trump's second presidency.
Right, specifically focusing on the shifts in trade, international relations, all based on that Hank Ure article you sent over.
Yeah. Yeah, and it really frames this period, highlighting big changes from that America First policy.
It definitely does. It kind of sets up this question of, what are the real world effects when a country goes all in on prioritizing itself like this?
Exactly. So let's get into it. What's the time frame we're talking about?
Okay, so the article marks the 100th day as April 29th, 2025.
Got it.
And right off the bat, the source uses the word chaos to describe this period.
Chaos. Strong word.
Yeah, and it ties that directly to the America First approach being pushed hard on, well, both trade and diplomacy, U.S. interests above everything else.
Okay, so let's break that down. Starting with trade. The article mentions a difference from Trump's first term.
It does. First time around, maybe more focus on negotiation deals. This time, the emphasis seems to be squarely on tariffs. Like, tariffs are the necessary tool.
Presented as unavoidable almost.
Exactly. And this leads to a pretty dramatic event the article calls Liberation Day, April 2nd.
Liberation Day, what happened?
Well, a baseline tariff, 10%, gets slapped on all U.S. trade partners.
Wow, across the board.
Across the board. And then on top of that, high reciprocal tariffs hit 57 specific partners, South Korea included.
Okay.
But the really big one, within days, China gets hit with a 145% tariff.
145%.
Yep. Which, as you can imagine, basically triggers a second major U.S.-China trade war. It wasn't subtle. A clear, aggressive new stance.
I can only imagine the market reaction. That kind of tariff.
Yeah, the article says the U.S. average effective tariff rate just exploded, went from about 2.5% up to somewhere between 18% and 22.5%.
Levels not seen since the Great Depression, it notes.
Exactly. So the financial markets. The reaction was pretty immediate and chaotic.
How so?
The article describes stocks, bonds, and the U.S. dollar all tumbling at the same time.
The triple whammy.
Pretty much. And the IMF weighed in, projecting a 0.9 percentage point cut to U.S. GDP growth for the year because of this trade war.
Almost a full percentage point. What about China?
Their projected hit was a bit less, a 0.6 percentage points.
Interesting. So the U.S. potentially feels a bigger immediate GDP impact. Did the strategists see that coming? GDP being, the total value of goods and services.
Yeah.
A key health check for the economy.
That's a really good point. The article doesn't explicitly say if they anticipated the bigger hit for the U.S., but it does suggest this potential outcome. It highlights different vulnerabilities.
Like what?
Well, the U.S. relies heavily on China for consumer goods, especially electronics. Hard to replace those quickly.
Right.
China, meanwhile, has maybe more flexibility replacing things like U.S. soybeans or petroleum they can source elsewhere or ramp up domestic production.
So the tariffs aimed at China could actually be causing significant pain for American consumers and businesses needing those imports.
That seems to be the implication.
Okay, so tariffs are flying.
Yeah.
What about negotiations? The article mentions trying to do deals with South Korea, Japan, India.
Yeah, there's a push for these bilateral deals, but the article suggests progress is, well, slow.
Not getting wrapped up in weeks like initially suggested.
Apparently not. A source from the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, the USTR, is quoted mentioning limitations.
Like what? Staffing.
Exactly. It's a relatively small agency, and trying to juggle multiple complex negotiations at once very quickly, it creates bottlenecks.
Makes sense. You can't just magic these complex deals into existence.
Right. And that limitation likely affects everything, including the big one, China.
Speaking of China, how are those talks going? The article mentioned a stalemate, but maybe some recent movement?
Yeah, the large-scale negotiations are stalled, basically at an impasse, but there are hints, maybe, of slight thawing. Trump has reportedly made some conciliatory noises recently, and Beijing apparently pulled back a big 125% tariff on some U.S. semiconductors.
Okay, so a little give and take, perhaps. Reciprocal tariffs, by the way, just means when countries hit back with their own tariffs, right?
Yeah.
Tit for tat.
Exactly. Tit for tat in trade. But overall, it still sounds pretty volatile.
And the article notes criticism about the strategy itself, or lack thereof.
It does. It highlights this feeling that the approach seemed to shift.
Yeah.
First targeting everyone, then focusing hard on China, then maybe pivoting back towards trying to negotiate.
A bit inconsistent.
That's the criticism mentioned, yeah. This lack of a clear, steady strategy.
Does the article bring in any experts on this?
It does. Marcus Nolan from the Peterson Institute apparently called the tariff policies bizarre, like hard to analyze using standard economics.
Bizarre. Okay. Anyone else?
Mark Peterson from UCLA, he argued these unclear policies actually hurt U.S. businesses, led to fewer jobs, and, ironically, more government spending, kind of self-defeating.
Not exactly ringing endorsements. And this is reflected in polling.
Seems so. The article mentions a CNN poll around that 100-day mark. Trump's approval rating was at 41%.
41%. How does that compare historically?
The article points out it's the lowest for a newly elected president since Eisenhower back in '53.
Okay, so trade is definitely a turbulent area. But America First isn't just about economics, right? Diplomacy is also a big part of the article. Ukraine, for instance.
Absolutely. The piece paints a picture of a more isolationist diplomatic approach, again, rooted in America First.
How did that play out with Ukraine?
Well, initially, the stance seemed to lean towards cutting back support, framing it as, a European problem mainly. Then, according to the article, it shifted towards a more favorable view towards Russia.
Really? Favorable?
That's the description used. And there was apparently a specific incident with President Zelensky.
What happened there?
The article describes an encounter late February where Trump reportedly spoke very bluntly, maybe harshly, to Zelensky during a White House visit, basically demanding compliance, arguing Ukraine didn't have much leverage. It's presented as a key example of this new diplomatic style.
Very direct. Transactional, almost. And there was a ceasefire proposal from Trump.
Yes. The plan outlined involves freezing the current front lines.
Freezing the lines. What would that mean on the ground?
It would effectively mean Russia keeps control of the territory it occupies, which is nearly 20% of Ukraine.
20%.
And Trump reportedly claimed Russia made a pretty big concession by not taking the whole country.
How's the international community reacting to all this, according to the source?
Not well. The article makes it clear the prevailing view is that these actions have really damaged trust in the U.S.
Why specifically?
Because they seem to clash with core principles of the post-World War II order. Things like territorial integrity, national sovereignty, the basic rules of how countries interact.
The established norms.
Exactly. Though the article does mention a slight, very recent shift towards criticizing Moscow again because talks have stalled, but the initial damage seems done.
What about the Ukrainian perspective? You mentioned Razum for Ukraine.
Right, Julian Hayda from that group. He noted Trump's early claim about ending the war quickly.
Yeah, I remember that.
Hayda expressed hope that maybe Trump now realizes Putin isn't likely to negotiate seriously. He pointed out Putin's track record of breaking agreements.
Okay, so America First seems to be shaking things up significantly on both trade and diplomatic fronts. How is the rest of the world responding? Are they just watching?
No, not at all. The article really emphasizes that other countries are actively adjusting their own strategies because of this.
Oh, so.
Ben Rhodes, former Obama advisor, wrote in the New York Times that these policies are systematically severing America from the globe, creating chaos on a global scale, sort of like Brexit, but bigger.
Severing America from the globe.
Right.
Strong words. Any specific examples? Europe.
Europe is highlighted as reacting fast. They're apparently relying less on U.S. weapons now.
Cutting dependence.
Yes, and European intelligence agencies are reportedly sharing less information with the U.S. too.
Less cooperation.
And Edward Lucas, a UK expert writing in foreign policy, made an interesting point. He said Europe is finally building up its own defense capability, something the U.S. has long wanted. But it's happening in a way that might actually hurt U.S. jobs, profits, and influence. The title of his piece was something like, U.S. will miss Europe's dependence when it's gone.
Oof. A double-edged sword, then. Is it just security? Or trade, too?
Trade as well. The EU is apparently looking at potentially restoring ties with China, even restarting talks about tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles.
So potentially realigning trade away from the U.S.
That seems to be the potential drift, yes.
The article brings in another academic, Nicholas Mulder. What's his take? Something about U.S. dominance, hegemony.
Right. Hegemony basically one country's dominant influence. Mulder argues that the more the U.S. pressures its allies, the more incentive they have to become more autonomous, less reliant on the U.S.
Makes sense.
He suggests that while some countries, maybe like Canada and Mexico, don't have many alternatives. Key allies in Europe and East Asia can gradually reduce their dependence on the U.S. market.
So the risk he sees is,
That the U.S. might be sacrificing long-term influence, its long-term interests, for maybe short-term gains?
trading long-term power for short-term goals. And there was one more perspective. Wendy Sherman.
Yeah, former Deputy Secretary of State. She drew a comparison to Trump's real estate background.
How so?
She argued that in real estate, if a deal falls through, okay, you just walk away, find another one. No biggie, relatively speaking.
Right.
But diplomacy, the stakes are vastly higher. It can be about war and peace, law versus authoritarianism. Failed deals have huge lasting consequences beyond just one transaction.
A very different ballgame. Okay, so let's try and wrap this up, this deep dive into the first 100 days based on the source. It really paints a picture of, well, major disruption.
Definitely. Significant upheaval seems to be the theme. In trade, you've got these aggressive tariffs, projected economic consequences, market volatility.
And in diplomacy, a fracturing of alliances, damaged trust, and a real questioning of those established international norms.
Exactly. And it's not just the U.S. acting. The rest of the world is reacting, adapting, potentially shifting global dynamics in response. Reducing reliance on the U.S. seems to be a key trend highlighted.
So you came here wanting to get a quick but thorough grasp of this complex period. We hope this look at the first 100 days through the lens of these sources is giving you a clearer picture of the America First approach in action and its potential ripple effects.
Which really leaves us with a big question for you to think about. Considering everything we've touched on, the economic analysis, the diplomatic fallout, the experts worried about alliances and global order, what do you think is the most significant long-term consequence here? Is this just a bumpy patch, a temporary disruption? Or are we actually seeing the beginnings of a fundamental reshaping of how the world works?